Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Have History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder. And last time, Hardee left the Army of Tennessee to help guard the coast. Now we see him combat William T. Sherman as that general pushes to the coast and north into the Carolinas. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. William Hardee had the unfortunate task of guarding the city of Savannah, Georgia. Worse yet, he possessed only about 1,000 troops to defend the city against the Federal threats. The telegraph wires were hot with messages to Richmond asking for troops for Savannah, or it would fall. Not only did he have to deal with William T. Sherman's approaching forces, in late November, about 5,000 men under Union General John P. Hatch from John G. Foster's Union contingent at Port Royal, South Carolina, steamed up the Broad River north of Savannah, threatening Hardee's communications. Hardee summoned Gustavus W. Smith and the Georgia militia to come to his aid. When they arrived, Smith went to Hardee. Smith had a problem. The Union troops were in South Carolina, not Georgia. The militia weren't required to go out of state. He said, "If you can satisfy me that it is absolutely necessary that my command shall go into South Carolina, I will endeavor to carry out your orders. If you do not satisfy me, I will be under the disagreeable necessity of withdrawing the state forces from your control." Hardee convinced Smith that it was necessary, and Smith proceeded to the Broad River. The Georgia militia threw back the Union forces and then returned to Savannah. Hardee then dispatched Lafayette McLaws with a little more than a brigade of men to a spot on the Georgia Central Railroad in an attempt to delay Sherman's advance. Then he sent Joseph Wheeler on a mission to destroy as much resources as possible between Sherman's army and Savannah, hoping to delay the Union juggernaut even further. Hardee's overall commander, P.G.T. Beauregard, became gravely concerned for Savannah, as well as Augusta, Georgia. He asked the two commanders at each outpost to come to him, but Hardee refused, saying if either of them left, the situation would deteriorate. Beauregard decided to come to Hardee, but first he sent out a written statement of what to do when Sherman got to the city. Having no army of relief to look to, and your forces being essential to the defense of Georgia and South Carolina, whenever you shall have to select between your safety and that of Savannah, sacrifice the latter, and form a junction with General Samuel Jones, holding the left bank of the Savannah and the railroad to this place as long as possible. With the approach of Sherman, Hardee concentrated all the forces available to him, somewhere around 10,000 men. He put every able-bodied man to work building trenches and got the mayor of the city to encourage its citizens to supply his soldiers with shovels and spades to build those works. In a decision that demonstrates Hardee's engineering skill and his talent as a commander, Hardee sliced the canal and the dikes for the rice fields, flooding the ground in front of his works with between 3 and 6 feet of water, creating a kind of moat to protect his soldiers. Hardee was relying on his few ships on the Savannah River to provide sufficient defense for his right flank and to also ferry his men across, but Sherman's batteries disabled many of them, making the situation more dangerous for Hardee to stay. Heavy skirmishing continued as Sherman began to envelop the city. Inside Savannah, Hardee had to deal with a mutiny by what was called the Foreign Battalion, a group of men he helped to enlist. He executed 7 of the ringleaders and sent the rest to South Carolina. Sherman attacked and captured Fort McAllister, the last obstacle between himself and communication with the Union ships along the coast. With Fort McAllister taken, Hardee knew the city would fall as Sherman's troops began threatening his line of retreat. Hardee ordered about 30 rice flats, 70 to 80 feet long and fastened end to end and covered with timber ripped from the Savannah wharves to construct 3 bridges over the Savannah River and to various islands to the mainland. At 9 p.m. on December 19th, it was complete. Hardee would evacuate the next night. He put together a detailed withdrawal schedule for his troops. The artillery ammunition that Hardee calculated would need to be destroyed was used for the Confederates' benefit by firing it at the Union soldiers from the forts guarding Savannah. They expelled all the extra ammunition, while that which could be saved moved over the makeshift bridges. Slowly throughout the night of the 20th and into the early morning of the 21st, the rebels made their way out of Savannah. The constant tread of the troops and the rumblings of the artillery as they poured over those long floating bridges was a sad sound, and by the glare of the large fires at the east of the bridge, it seemed like an immense funeral procession stealing out of the city in the dead of night. One thing Hardee wasn't able to take out of Savannah was its stores of cotton. Sherman found 35,000 cotton bales. Now spoils of war, the cotton could have been used by the Confederate government, and if not taken with the soldiers, at least burned. Officials began to criticize Hardee for this, and hypothesized that he did it to enrich his brother, a cotton factor. But Hardee put those theories to rest when he said, "The cotton was distributed throughout the city in cellars, garrets, and warehouses, where it could not have been burnt without destroying the city. It had not been sent off by railroad previous to the cutting of the road, because railroad transportation was monopolized for removal of ordnance, commissary, and other important government stores. From the cutting of the road to the evacuation of the city, 12 days, every man was required to work on the lines. Every wagon, dray, and cart that could be impressed was needed to keep the troops in a line 12 miles long, supplied with ordnance and commissary stores. Not a man, not a woman, could have been spared to collect the cotton in a place where it could have been burnt." One of Hardee's biographers explained, "The suggestion that the financial interests of his brother influenced him is inconsistent with Hardee's scrupulous integrity. Furthermore, the commissary and ordnance stores salvaged from Savannah prolonged Confederate military resistance more than any amount of cotton could have." The same biographer would praise Hardee. "As commander of this garrison, he went beyond his traditional successful retreat in the face of the enemy. He had to. Never had he operated so close to the enemy with troops so limited in both numbers and quality. He displayed a signal aptitude in improvisation and in utilization of terrain and resources. Sherman's men marveled at the Confederate battery that had been mounted on a railroad car. It was moved from one front to another with celerity, firing accurately into exposed groups of men, and generally harassing the Union army. Hardee should be credited for the novel technique of employing ships not only to hinder Union troop movements, but to guard land features and to serve as mobile forts on the Confederate right flank. This close integration of naval and land forces represents one of the finest displays of joint operations by a Confederate commander during the war. The nature and location of Hardee's main defense position demonstrates his skill in using his terrain advantageously, for the flooded rice fields and canals effectively offset the disparity in numbers of men. Hardee's main line evoked admiring comments from friend and foe alike, and gave great assurance to the many untried defenders. To have removed the large civilian group, the war materiel, and 10,000 men from the presence of 60,000 veteran troops commanded by one of the ablest Civil War commanders represents one of Hardee's finest achievements. Hardee himself said, "Though compelled to evacuate the city, there is no part of my military life to which I look back with so much satisfaction." Hardee moved to Charleston, South Carolina, and began to get its defenses in order. Hardee didn't have any illusion about the situation. He knew he would need to evacuate eventually, but he would delay Sherman as long as possible. The Army of Tennessee had been defeated in their namesake state, and pieces of it would be streaming back to Hardee to fend off Sherman. Hardee wrote to President Davis that, "I am acting strictly on the defensive, and unless heavily reinforced, must continue to do so." The governor of South Carolina, Andrew McGrath, visited Hardee in Charleston when he became aware that that city would be evacuated, when it became militarily unfeasible to protect. After visiting with Hardee, he wrote to Davis to send Hardee troops, that Charleston was the heart of the Confederacy, not Richmond. McGrath also called on the governors of North Carolina and Georgia to send all available troops. Hardee wrote to Davis, "The people of Charleston, though in many respects to be admired, are so entirely wrapped up in their own state and city as to be unmindful of the wants of other portions of our country. To them, Charleston is the Confederacy, and to save Charleston, they are willing that Lee should give up Richmond, or any other section of the Confederacy, so their selfish ambition might be gratified." On February 17, 1865, Hardee evacuated Charleston and headed north, eventually getting into North Carolina. The Georgia militia were sent back to their homes by order of that state's governor, so Hardee's force was further reduced. Likewise, South Carolina's militia left, as well as a general desertion of troops. Hardee possessed a total of 8,000 men, counting his cavalry. This means Hardee lost half of his force since leaving Charleston, and he had seen no major engagement. Joseph E. Johnston, Hardee's old commander of the Army of Tennessee, now took back command of that army, or what was left of it. He wanted to concentrate what forces he could at Smithfield, North Carolina. Hardee progressed towards that town, but south of Averysboro, Sherman caught up to him. Hardee planned to use the terrain to his best advantage, putting both of his flanks on waterways, the Cape Fear and Black Rivers, and confront the Federals at the narrowest point of land between the two rivers. He would force Henry Slocum, one of Sherman's commanders, to crowd his men into the small space. Plus, creeks and swamps were in Hardee's front, providing obstacles for the Union soldiers to traverse. Hardee's main line consisted of reliable veteran troops. His front two lines were made up of less reliable troops, like those who saw service only in Charleston during the war. With this attack in depth, Hardee presented a battle line not unlike what American General Daniel Morgan put together at the Battle of Cowpens about 100 years before. On March 16th, Union forces clashed with Hardee's battle line. The first two lines fought and then withdrew, some in disorder, but Hardee was able to stabilize the main line and hold the Federals off for the day. However, Hardee knew he couldn't withstand much more and withdrew his troops when darkness came. He finally linked up with Johnston, and at Bentonville, Johnston organized a stand against the approaching Federals. Hardee commanded the right flank, consisting of some of the troops he had led in the Army of Tennessee the year previous, and began the Confederate assault. The Federals were thrown back, but as Hardee was trying to push his troops to capitalize on their moment, he found that some of the men were disheartened and showing hesitation, possibly with thoughts of the Battle of Franklin on their minds. He rode to the front and raised their spirits. They recognized their commander, now seen for the first time since the October before, and raising a cheer such as those old hills had never echoed before, they rose the ascent, dashed across the field, and drove the enemy pell-mell from those works. Hardee, after commanding the double quick, led the charge, and with his knightly gallantry, dashed over the enemy breastworks on horseback in front of his men. Hardee drove deep into the enemy's flank and then began to attack them from the rear, but his attacks to that exposed position did little damage because the Confederates in the Federals' front didn't put pressure on the enemy, and they were able to turn their attention to Hardee. The Union line finally stabilized, and Hardee withdrew his men to Johnston's defensive line. Johnston hoped that the Federals would attack him in the entrenched position, but he was wrong. However, an attack did come, but it was in the Confederate rear, threatening the hospitals. An entire Union division bared down on the Confederate position. Johnston rushed Hardee to the location, and Hardee orchestrated some of the best military feats of his career, moving troops from one flank to the next, and even leading attacks to beat back the enemy threat. Finally, he called on the Texas Rangers to deliver a heavy blow to the Union soldiers. In the Texans' ranks was Willie Hardee, the general's son. Willie had been chomping at the bit to get into the fight, and he looked up to the Rangers. The general, just a few hours before, let his son officially enlist in that group. Now he ordered his son into battle. The Texans and the general's son did their duty, throwing back the enemy in their front. Hardee rode up to the cavalry general, Wade Hampton, and said, "General, that was nip and tuck, and for a while I thought Tuck had it." Soon litter bearers carried a soldier past the two generals. They were carrying Hardee's son Willie. He had been horribly wounded in the attack. Hardee dismounted and ran over to the young man. Then the litter bearers carried him away. Johnston had no option but to withdraw in the face of Sherman's concentrated numbers. Willie was taken to Hillsboro, where Hardee's wife cared for the young man. Willie passed away on March 24th. A military funeral was held at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church in Hillsboro. The Confederate Army of Tennessee made it to Smithfield, where it was reorganized. Johnston went to meet with President Davis, leaving Hardee in charge of the army. Hardee faced a hopeless situation. He was expected to keep the army prepared, but desertions made the army melt away. Hardee wrote to Beauregard, "We are all agog respecting the object of the halt, and surmises are that negotiations are afoot between Johnston and Sherman. If such be not the case, it would be well for me to know it as soon as practicable, that I may contradict it. The report, as you may well conceive, can do our troops no good." Johnston returned to the army on April 19th and reported to the men that an armistice was declared while negotiations took place. This scared some of Hardee's men, particularly the Arkansans, whom Hardee had led into battle since the early part of the war. The Arkansans came to Hardee saying they were afraid that if they surrendered, that they may spend months, if not years, in Union prison camps. Hardee quieted their fears, saying that if they remained in the army, he would see them across the Mississippi. They also feared of the journey back to Arkansas. Hardee organized some wagons with what supplies were available to be sent to South Carolina, where they would be used to barter for the necessities of the march back to Arkansas. On April 26th, Johnston formally surrendered the army and all the troops under his command. It was agreed that the soldiers would be given 10 days' rations by the Union Army, but they would need to supply the transportation. Johnston named Hardee to work with Union General John Schofield to implement this movement of supplies. Hardee went to Raleigh to meet with Schofield. On the return trip, a newspaper reporter secured passage on the train to Greensboro and interviewed Hardee. The reporter asked about the institution of slavery. Hardee responded, "I accept this war as the providence of God. He intended that the slave should be free, and now he is. Slavery was never a paying institution. For instance, my wife owned about 100 slaves. 40 of the 100 were useless for work, yet she had to feed these 40 in order to get work of the other 60. The blacks will be worse off for this war. Will any of your abolitionists feed and clothe half a dozen little children in order to get the work of a man and a woman? Sir, our people can pay the working blacks a fair compensation for their services, and let them take care of their own families, and then have as much left at the end of the year as we had under the old system." About Confederates wanting peace, Hardee explained, "I think the people of the South are anxious for it. They wanted it 2 years ago. I then saw that our cause could not succeed." He was then asked about guerrilla warfare and if it would break out. He responded, "So help me God, sir, if we do, I am willing and ready to fight to put an end to it. Let me impress it upon you that the people of the South want to live in peace with the people of the North, and you will find they will do it. They will do it cheerfully, provided your government does not resort to harsh measures. If it does resort to such measures, I cannot answer for the consequences. We staked our all on the success of our arms, and they failed us, and now we are willing to return and live under the laws of the United States as we find them." Hardee went on to say, "I confess that I was one of the hot Southerners who shared the notion that one man of the South could whip 3 Yankees, but the first year of the war pretty effectually knocked that nonsense out of us, and to tell you the truth, ever since that time we military men have generally seen that it was only a question how long it would take to wear our army out and destroy it. We have seen that there was no real hope of success except by some extraordinary accident of fortune, and we have also seen that the politicians would never give up till the army was gone. So we have fought with the knowledge that we were to be sacrificed, with the result we see today, and none of us could tell who would live to see it. We have continued to do our best, however, and have meant to fight as if we were sure of success." Upon arriving at Greensboro, Hardee accompanied some Union generals and their staff to the headquarters of Johnston, then retired to his own headquarters. The army was paroled and headed toward Salisbury. Hardee would accompany it, but the North Carolina soldiers didn't want him to depart until they had a chance to say goodbye. They lined up in formation and the flag was furled in front of his headquarters. With that, he said goodbye and proceeded to Salisbury. From there, he traveled with a large section of the Army of Tennessee, many of them refusing to leave his side until they made sure he was safe at home. They marched and rode through the Carolinas into Georgia and finally Alabama, where his wife's plantations were. From there, soldiers from the Gulf and the Trans-Mississippi went to Mobile, and some boarded steamers destined for homes they hadn't seen in 4 years. Hardee was escorted by some of his men to one of his wife's plantations near Demopolis, Alabama. He went to work on the plantation, with he and Mary and some of the children living in a log cabin that had once been occupied by one of their overseers. About 75 freed slaves now worked on the plantation as sharecroppers. The plantations were in fairly good condition because of their location, and Hardee had 160 bales of cotton that he sold at a great profit because the market was up right after the war. With some of his profits, he sent a check for $522 to Jefferson and Varina Davis to help them out financially. After about a year of running the operations on his plantations, he and Mary moved to Selma, Alabama, where Hardee helped to start the Selma Fire and Marine Insurance Company. However, his main reason for coming to Selma was to take the position as president of the Selma and Meridian Railroad Company. It was a promising company before the war, but had been wrecked physically as well as financially because of the conflict. Its capital was put in Confederate bonds, and now that was gone. In 1866, Hardee went to work attempting to revitalize the once promising railroad. Hardee first went to New York to find a bank to lend him money for the railroad, but none were willing to give him a loan. He then turned to the United States Army and purchased 6 locomotives and 50 flat cars for $142,000, but he would need to pay that off in a year. He then obtained a lease to use the Northeast and Southwest Alabama Railroad to expand the reach of the Selma and Meridian Railroad. Meanwhile, Hardee sought a pardon, getting dozens of signatures for his petition, and handed in his paperwork. Politicians balked at his petition, so Hardee called on his friend William T. Sherman to help with the process. Still, it took 2 years for him to get pardoned. The railroad business venture failed, even with Hardee's meticulous work eventually being sold to a company in New York. His home was the scene of many visits by former Confederate and Union officers. For a time, Joseph E. Johnston lived in Selma and made regular visits to his old subordinate. In his later years, Hardee liked to garden. His neatness was well known, and he never failed to wear his jacket when he left the house, and instructed his children to dress nicely. The only time he didn't dress in his nicest clothes was when he was gardening, something his children teased him about. Hardee was diagnosed with stomach cancer in 1872. To relieve his ailments, he took trips to White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. In 1873, he made a trip there to be part of the formation of the Southern Historical Society. However, when he got there, he became ill and was confined to his bed for the whole summer. A delegation from the society came to his bedside to express their regret at his illness. That delegation included Fitzhugh Lee, Jubal Early, John Letcher, and Raphael Sims. By the fall, Hardee had recovered some and put on a train, but only made it as far as Wytheville, Virginia. There, Joseph E. Johnston came to see a sick friend in his railroad car. Hardee was moved to the Buck Hotel in Wytheville and died there on November 6, 1873. The funeral in Selma was said to have been the biggest funeral in the city. Hardee's body was taken to Live Oak Cemetery in Selma, with his large black horse falling behind, with Hardee's boots turned backward in the stirrups, and a veteran of the Army of Tennessee leading the horse. Mary would pass away 2 years later at the age of 35 from tuberculosis. In a weird coincidence, Mary would die in the same house, under the same physician's care, from the same disease that Hardee's first wife passed away in and from. William J. Hardee literally wrote the book that officers on both sides of the Civil War used to train their troops and themselves. His impact on the war can't be overestimated in that regard. His strict military decorum scares some soldiers, but once they met him in person, his charming and kind nature showed through, dispelling any ideas of a tough exterior. However, when performing military duties, Hardee expected soldiers to adhere to a strict military decorum. Before and during the war, his soldiers would be drilled to assure Hardee that those men would enter combat and perform to the best of their abilities. His nickname of Old Reliable came from his dependability in any situation. Through the majority of the war, he put forth a solid performance, but he didn't stand out like other giants of the conflict. When he did, like at the Battle of Atlanta, the evacuation of Savannah, or the Battle of Bentonville, it was during the war's last 9 months, so any success seemed to be looked on as simply a last gasp from a dying army. His genius came through in the way his subordinates conducted themselves, most notably Patrick Cleburne. The two worked incredibly well together and became great friends. Each one relied on the other. The Corps commander needed to do less on the battlefield when he had such capable division commanders on the field. That's why in the last 2 months of the war, Hardee led charges in battle, because much of his officer corps had gone, and he needed to take personal command. In that way, his expert training hindered his name from becoming prominent and mainstream. Nevertheless, Hardee was a fixture of the war in the Western theater and a vital part of the Army of Tennessee. He cared for his soldiers, and they repaid him for it through their actions on the field of battle. Hardee's legacy will most likely revolve around the manual of arms he created and the hat that bears his name. But let us not forget that in many ways, it was the dependable Hardee that trained and coordinated over half of the troops in the Army of Tennessee. And although that army didn't see many victories, it wasn't because of anything Hardee lacked. He did all he could to keep that army together, and stood as a constant symbol to the soldiers in that army of professionalism and dependability.